So the amount of you guys that have sent me this video wanting me to discuss and break it down has been overwhelming. In fact, the number of videos that you guys have been sending me wanting me to break down is growing by the day. And the reason why this one's jumping the list is because of how hot of a topic it is, but also how important of a subject it is to me personally, something we cover here on the channel in depth, especially as it relates to MMORPGs. But this is By Force Gaming. We've had him on the podcast. Awesome guest. And I haven't seen the video yet, but I'm going to go ahead and hit a like on it. That's something that I just like to do, especially with reaction videos itself. Now, this video will probably be clipped down into kind of the core components. So if you want to go watch the core video and then you want to come back for my discussion pieces, you're more welcome to do so. I hope you guys enjoy this video. If you feel like it earns it, be sure to hit that like button and then keep your suggestions coming as we break into more discussion style reaction videos, hopefully to add a lot of value to that is the YouTube and the MMORPG and just gaming in general. So welcome to the channel again if you're new, welcome back if you're already a subscriber, and we're gonna go ahead and just jump right into this video, and hopefully we're gonna have a really good time. So I guess we'll see how it plays out, and we'll let Force take it away.
If you've been paying attention over the past couple of years to the world of video game reporting, you may have noticed a trend concerning the health of recent releases. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Halo Infinite Steam player count falls below Halo Master Chief Collection. Apex Legends revenue figures reveal massive drop in popularity. Star Wars Battlefront player count is poor, dominated by Fallout 4. New World has lost almost 90% of its players since launch. Need I go on? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Realm
Keep
Royale
going.
lost about 95% of its player base. The Division player count has dropped 93%. For Honor now has 95% of its player base lost, worse than Division 1. Anthem's player count paints a very grim picture. Lost Arc peak players down 80%. Elden Ring concurrent player count has dropped dramatically, almost 90% losses. We are obsessed with concurrent player counts in games.
Oh my gosh, so much so that it just is weird to the point of absurdity. But I will still find people that will defend it in terms of their own, like, I see it, and maybe this is just my perspective from obviously, and like this is obviously my perspective, this is my video, but when it comes down to it, it's like trying to use it as a way of beating down some kind of perceived competition. And I think this is inherent almost in a games as a service mindset, right? It does bring out our tribal nature. It does drive us into limited amounts of time, and the more people playing our game usually generates benefits for us as the player, right? So there is this sense of almost a way of like evangelical mindset of trying to get people to come into your game, to kind of represent your game, to kind of do all this, and then essentially other games as a service, even other genres within that space, there is this pocket of gamers that do feel adversarial. At least it feels adversarial in terms of reading text over on Reddit, Twitter, in comments, as opposed to like if you were probably having a real vocal conversation with a person, it probably might not feel so adversarial, because there's nothing wrong with liking your game. There's nothing wrong with telling people about it. But essentially, I think the nature and the medium of social media does make that condensed, etc. And so there has been this shift, and maybe there's always been that. We just have more data at our hands in terms of that, those numbers, right? And to use those numbers is to spin a narrative that not necessarily is true. There is a point in which that if you have 0 people playing your game, up to like a certain number, like it's like that game really isn't sustainable, and thus it might not be a game worthy of your time and investment. But the player base actually doesn't know what that number is. That number ends up acting as a method in which that trust is built, right? And what I mean by that is, in lieu of trusting that the company is going to keep making the game and doing things for the game, because content ultimately will be key, or king in that regards, it acts as kind of a gap of trust. Like if you do not trust that company or that game is going to continue to be around, concurrency ends up filling in that level. Oh, they're doing good, they've got player bases, then they're going to keep with it, because we have seen companies just decide to turn off these games. And the thing about these games, online games, tends to be a challenge, because if they go away, there really isn't a way to play them. You end up having to have big communities working extra hard to be able to create private servers so that those games can exist or continue to persist. But it never really feels the same. Like the game gets shut down and then it's gone, and that never feels really good.
Specifically, we're obsessed with how many people are leaving a game and how many people are still left. And it's not just games journalists and YouTubers looking to clickbait, although there is plenty of that for sure, but also just go to the forums or Reddit page of any game released in the past few years, do a quick search, and you are guaranteed to find plenty of threads talking about the number of people leaving the game and raising the question, is this game dead? And if you were to base your opinion on these discussions, these articles, and these YouTube videos, the answer would always be yes. The game is dead. Every game, in fact, appears to be dead or dying. Dead. So like, okay, what's going on here? Because that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Well, I think there is at least in my view, when it comes to a game and its population, I think dying and dead is a very personal statement. So if you add the phrase to me or for me, it actually then starts to ring true. So where I end up seeing it the most is like, when you start to see players who put in 1,000 hours or 2,000 hours or 3,000 hours, then talk about how a game is dying. If you add for them, in that regards, then that statement ends up being as accurate as absolutely possible, namely because it just feels that they're going to have to step away either through burnout or maybe they didn't enjoy it. And so when I see people write that, when I hear that phrase, I always hear the phrase for me. I always in my mind just automatically hear that added to it, because dying ends up being the equivalency of server shutdown. So I always kind of say the game's shutting down. If the game's going to shut down, the game is turning off. Like that in and of itself is really kind of what I think they're trying to create, that kind of fear and that shock and that drive. But games die all the time. Player bases, especially within communities, die all the time. It happens in every game because players reach a point where they just need a break, and they're just either not understanding their feelings well enough in terms of their relationship with the game itself. Like, is it dying? Is it like what is my relationship with that game in this moment? And it could be very positive. It could be in that honeymoon phase. It could be in that grind phase. And I've stated this numerous times that I feel like games as a service games have 3 seasons: the season of hype, the season of grind, and the season of burnout, or the season of bitch. Is kind of what I end up using interchangeably for that 3rd season, and then it goes back around, like as they continue to make the cycle. So as you're in the phase of just being burnt out and angry, news starts coming about the next big update, and all of a sudden you either enter into these mini hype cycles, and then according to kind of a bigger circular hype cycle as well. So there's a lot to kind of unpack there. So whenever you see this game is dead, etc., like just if you add in the word for me, like I think you'll understand the person who's writing that article much better. A lot of different elements that go into this fixation on player count, but also many reasons why we continue to see example after example of new game comes out, is popular for a time, but then loses 70, 80, 90% of its players shortly thereafter.
Hype on that note is also just such a hell of a drug. A lot of gamers, especially in terms of the population, gamers in just the general context is such a massive term that encapsulates so many different types of people. And so if you actually look at what you would almost call your impassioned group, that group might stick around and continue to play regardless of whether their game's the top game or not. We actually saw this happen last year with the big swell in with Final Fantasy XIV, pushing it to numbers that it's never seen before, and it's retained some of those players, and some of those players have also moved on. And it would be disingenuous to say those new players that either didn't resonate with the game or completed the game and are waiting for new content are any less than the gaming kind of mindset. They're going to move from game to game, and they're going to consume the content of game to game, and then they might come back, and then they're kind of this overwhelming horde that moves from place to place. And they're maybe looking for a home game, especially in a game as a service, this is my main game, and then they might just be there to visit. So there's a lot of different ways that goes about it. But in terms of it, especially within the ebbs and flows of specifically MMORPGs, like to design the games like Final Fantasy 14 has done, and making it that ability to step away and take a break and come back without like feeling like you're being punished into the ground for doing so, I think ends up actually working in its favor. And that's why you end up seeing kind of big dips in the population flow. And overall, like if you've been a part of that community, like pre-expansion to the expansion and a little bit post-expansion ends up being like the biggest time where the most people are playing and are excited because you're in that hype cycle, you're in that grind cycle. And then when people feel burnt out, like Yoshi P and like content creators like me, like we encourage you to take breaks because that's good for you. You're going to enjoy your experience when you come back, especially if you kind of listen to that aspect of you. But it's weird because like outside of just that one game, like you see that on the meta level of games as service, and it's like people don't understand that games are seasonal for a lot of gamers. And it doesn't mean they have to be seasonal for you, but for a lot of gamers, games are seasonal and they're going to play them and then they're not. And actually they're probably not even engaged in whatever that, the population dip numbers are in the first place. They're just like, am I having fun? Yes or no. And for them, it's just a simple, factor.
Every game actually will have a rather dramatic decline in player count eventually. There are, of course, some exceptions. Games that come up and post-launch will steadily grow. Fortnite.
One of the things about the exceptions, especially as he's talking about Fortnite, like it actually happens so rare, but it seems like people feel like everything's the exception to the rule. And this is, I think, maybe natural to human, that how we think about ourselves, but it's that like with World of Warcraft within the MMORPG space, like I don't think we'll see another MMO come out that will continue to grow like from its initial high. So you hit the high number and then you continue to break that high number, then you continue to break that high number, right? What I mean by that is that I think there can still be the next big MMORPG, and that it might be out already, but it's going to be the MMO that comes out and then continues to release and continues to update and continues to put in the work month over month over month, to the point where it ends up being like an establishment, a part of the genre, right? Like you could say that like ESO is doing really well. It's got the player base and the numbers. People speak of it highly, but when it came out, it struggled, but it continued to put in the work. It continued to put in the work. Final Fantasy 14, same story, continued to put in the work, and then over time, like they end up building out this experience and this quality and this this fandom that is very supportive and very evangelical towards bringing in new people and talking about it and praising it. And so there are rarely exceptions. For Fortnite, for example, and that was, I think, a lot of like these moments that happened in time, right? When you look at it, you had the Logan Paul Forest video, YouTube changing policies and incentivizing more family-friendly stuff. Fortnite versus PUBG. Fortnite had a much more family and a visual appeal that appealed to these algorithmic changes. You have Ninja coming into the scene, stating how much he made, almost $300,000 over Prime subs alone in 1 month, which then makes people go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of money to be made, and that drives in that incentive factor, and then you have this massive loop cycle feeding in on itself. That doesn't happen each and every game. And it's interesting to me that if that's always the expectation, that it's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. I think what it means is that if you're making this kind of game, it's going to be a game that you're going to have to put in a lot of work. And if you like it, then you're going to be in a good spot. But if you're not, like, there's nothing wrong with like dipping out and going and playing something else.
Today, it is down nearly 90%. Pathetic, right? Well, no, not actually, because that still puts them at an average daily peak at roughly 350,000 concurrent players.
And so to kind of figure out how many people are actively playing, the general industry standard rule is either a 7 to 11 multiplier. So you would times 332. Let's just go ahead and actually do it. Calculator. Let's pull it up here. So you'd actually take, yeah, that's good. 332,052. So on the low end, and you can check the math if you actually go look at the hours played by average game time, and you actually will end up getting a very similar number. So on the low end, they've got 2.3 million players a month playing PUBG. And so then if we go and look at the high end, so again, 332,052 times 11, you'll end up seeing that, yeah, so anywhere from 2.3 million to 3.6 million actively monthly users with that game. That's insane. That's amazing. If you go start looking at other games, especially other MMOs, Lost Ark still, despite people and the claims of bots, which bots are there, it's still driving it. I think the fact that it's free to play in terms of bots, etc., ends up helping it out dramatically. Anyway, let's continue.
And while we don't have Steam player count numbers for every game, we can use Google Trends as a barometer. As imperfect as this may be, it does give us a general sense of things.
I'm going to talk about the imperfection here, though, naturally, because I'll see people try to oh, it's not the actual number. We don't actually have actual numbers, and we won't. Yeah, and those don't exist. So if you're wanting an actual number, go work for the company and see if they'll reveal those secrets to you. I don't think it's actually that important. I know people obsess or stress about that itself, but what we're actually looking at, what we have to go off of, is that barometer, is that heat map, is that idea of okay, generally where does this fall? And again, that's where the industry standard 7 to 11 comes in. That's where, when you look at average gaming play times per week, divided by total hours played, you can end up really getting a good sense of how many people on average are playing it over the course of any given stretch of time. And the numbers actually check out pretty well. But you'll still have people who will discount them, and they'll discount them because it either doesn't feed their narrative, their worldview, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not sitting here trying to change your mind on things. I'm just going to tell you how the math works and how at best we can come to a good educated guess in terms of that, and that ends up being very accurate, or at least close to as accurate as possible.
We know from back when Blizzard published subscriber counts for World of Warcraft that game peaked at the end of Wrath of the Lich King in 2010. That was a solid 6 years of growth, which is very impressive, but ever since then it has been a downward slide. So
with WoW, though, one of the things I think that actually actively hurts the genre right now is that expectation that another MMO is going to do exactly what WoW did. The situations and the circumstances and the environment, all of those things would have to be true again for that to happen. I think what you'll see with WoW and other MMOs is they'll come out, put in the work, continue to put in the work, build a solid foundation. I think overall MMOs might improve with that mindset, but people still look at that. People were like, that's not 12 million subscribers. This game failed. It's if that is your barometer for playing an MMO, you're gonna miss out on a lot of really good experiences. I had that as a young man. I ended up saying I'm not gonna play a game unless it scores 9.0 or higher. And there's a lot of great games that I missed out because I ended up becoming this. I kind of put this weird line in the sand for what my time was worth, and that was just, I don't do that anymore, thankfully.
Which is an accurate observation. Elden Ring peaked at about 953,000 concurrent players on March 3rd, a week after it launched, and then a month later that dropped down to 450,000 peak, and
just in a what you would classify as a single player RPG, this is massive. That is so incredible what Elden Ring did this year. In terms of just and those numbers should be celebrated, but it's the same. We've seen this happen with even tons of single player games, these numbers being reported, player drop. It's this weird addiction and this drug, I guess, because it's something that obviously gathers people's attention, and then ultimately it drives the conversation of oh, well, of course, for the majority of people who understand games and life and balance, people yeah, of course, I'm not playing all the time. I played the game and then I finished the game or something like that.
Of today, it sits around 50,000 peak concurrent players, which is roughly a 95% decrease. Dead game, right? No, not a dead game. It's just a game that a lot of people played and then finished. Whether or not they completed the game or not, they played through it, they had their experience, and then they put it down, they moved on, as is the natural progression for most games. Let me touch on this. There was recently an article posted on PC Gamer titled "Fixating on Player Counts and Dead Games is Making Gaming Worse." The main takeaway from this was pretty much that we care way too much about player counts, and we should instead just enjoy and play the games that we find fun, regardless of how many other people are playing. And I agree to an extent. I agree that it shouldn't matter if there are 20,000 or 20 concurrent players in a particular game. If I am having a good time while I'm playing, that is what counts, right?
Well, the exception here, and I'm pretty sure that he's about to get into it, ends up being that if you're talking about a game in which that you have a lot of player investment, you don't want to put that investment into a game that has the risk of going away. And being that these games, and we've seen games go away, that ends up making it to where like, oh gosh. And so the death spiral is essentially that idea that a player drops, and so people are worried that like, is that game going to exist? Is it going to continue? Is it, like if I put my time into that game, will it be respected? Will I feel like, and if that game goes away, like how awful would that I feel with that? And so when that death spiral occurs, it is that self-fulfilling prophecy. So less people are worried that not enough people are playing it, so they stop playing it. So people see the player drop, so people worry that the people aren't playing it, so they either stop playing it or don't play it, and so that drops. Now essentially at some point you hit what's called a floor. You hit like, okay, here's the players that are playing it, and ultimately then it becomes that question of trust. Will they continue to develop the game and offer in ways to invite players back in? This is the case for any persisting game. Like, what is the content cycle? What is that mini hype cycle, grind cycle, and burnout cycle within kind of a bigger set of news, so that ultimately the player then looks at it and says, oh, like they're continuing to support the game. Players are coming back to the game, because at some point, like, you bring in that and you start to see kind of the ebbs and flows of the community itself. And then ultimately you got some marketing, you got some kind of big announcements that can kind of, like Fortnite, for example, released the no build mode, and you saw numbers and streamers and players and stuff like that all kind of drive in, because now that the game has changed and it's new and it's fresh and it's exciting again, things like that end up being an example of that hype cycle.
Update plans might get delayed or even canceled altogether. That content roadmap that they launched with, if not enough people bought and are playing the game, just forget about it. It might as well have been a hallucination. So when a new
Yeah, and we've seen this happen enough that people like have that natural baked in fear. And so then it comes down to, especially within the MMO genre, we have this like wave of indie MMOs that came out, had hype and had excitement, and were trying to appeal to a certain type of gamer, but then they didn't have the funding to then continue the build. They didn't have the funding to continue the bringing in new content. And ultimately one of two things happened. They either established with a set player base that they had the finances to support the game itself, and that became what it is, or they ended up having to close down and turn off the servers, which that's where the risk is. Like, players, understandably, like, don't want to sit here and invest their time in a game that has that level of risk. And so it's about establishment and trust. And games, especially like if we take New World as a really good case study right now, is that Amazon has the funding that they can keep that game running for however long they want. But do they have the base and the trust of the player base? And I think depending on where you are in your relationship with AGS, the answer is going to widely vary. And so it's just going to be a function of, like, if they continue to invest and continue to develop and make new content, that's going to help establish trust for especially for not just for New World, but for their other games that they're working on actively right now. The only way to know is with time. There's no amount of money or amount of no one update that's going to sit here and people go, oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's they mean that they were in it for the 10 years, because Anthem said that they had that, and then EA pulled the plug after they made a lot of money and with Anthem, but then they were like, yeah, we're going to work on 2.0, and then they said, no, I guess we're not doing that, and that's unfortunate. And I think that tells me, for EA's case, that if they come out with another games as a service game, that it's not worth my time to invest in right now. I will let them wait a couple years and see if they're still around. And so that essentially is what I think is the risk there. And so some people apply that across the board, and I don't blame them for doing so. But when it comes down to it, like with anything within EA, within their wheelhouse, if they release any games as a service, the game's got to be out for a few years before I'll even trust that what they mean, what they say. And that's just the factor of it.
Fund and sustain the game's development. And yeah, this has been occurring in the MMO space for a long time. We are used to it. But recently, in the past few years, it has started to creep into other more mainstream parts of gaming, as these always online titles in other genres have reached the end of their financially viable to keep afloat cycle.
Well, we've also seen in that same vein that all these other genres have been adopting more MMO, massively multiplayer online mindset. It's not necessarily the MMORPG, but we were talking in Discord recently about, like, is Fortnite an MMO? It's massive, it's multiplayer, it's online, and so MMO is going to have a different worldview depending on like how you look at the game itself. And so when it comes down to it, now even Fortnite, you have like leveling XP, like you have all that aspect. So to the point where it's like MMOs came out, and then other games genres have all adopting it, so it makes sense there's a natural trickle down or connection to some of the things that plague the MMORPG genre itself, and how it would impact and become a natural factor in all these other games. What's ironic or annoying or frustrating or just downright clickbait is the single player game version of that. Like, oh, I can't believe like everybody's not playing Mario Odyssey right now. Bad game. Like, it's like, come on. And it's just, that's just a, that would get me to click and then go into the comments and be like, what? And then that's just algorithmically what they want.
You don't get the entire story just by looking at these numbers. But if you take player count and you add in player experience, the discussion that's happening online around these games, then it starts to paint a picture of what the larger issues may be and what could be causing player decline beyond that natural drop that every game, even the best games in the world, all see. And
now, one thing I think he didn't mention here that I think is actually really critical, especially to the relationship of the game as a service, because that is how I view it, because there is the aspect of communication, especially with issues and bugs and errors, right? When it comes down to it, we've continued to see games, especially people talk about it launching in an incomplete state, that if you want to play one of these games, you should at least wait a couple of months, just so that you don't have to go through all the rigmarole. But what I look at also in that time period is that communication from the company. Are they hearing? Are they communicating? Are they understanding? Understanding is a real, serious critical aspect of it. So in relation to the items that he mentioned there, I would add that, are they communicating effectively? And then what does the turnaround time look like to address these issues? Are more servers needed, or is there some kind of bug fixing? And personally speaking, I would rather, and I guess there's some kind of legal, financial law in place, because I would rather just games launch in an open beta state with that progress that carries forward and the understanding that, hey, this is an open beta. Like we saw Fortnite continue to have beta for years. Like it was in beta for a very long time, and it could do that because it was a free-to-play version of the game itself. And I think that essentially is where, like, if you're trying to charge in a buy-to-play way, that you have to kind of launch and officially be released as opposed to like a paid beta, which that all gets into a mess of like how to navigate that. But when it comes down to games as a service, I really wish they would just launch as a beta with that label, letting people know like, hey, this is to also help with the influx and the hype, and to really drive and fix all these issues, identify them. Obviously, like trying to have all that fixed beforehand, but in terms of just like overwhelming volume and scalability, comes down to it is like, yeah, like even Outriders this year still, like with its expansion, had problems when I was trying to play it at launch. So it's just like, all right, come on guys.
This isn't 2004, when WoW came out and there were like one or two other good MMOs to potentially play. Nowadays, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of great games that we could just boot up right now and play instead. And that list will just keep on growing with time. So there are tough decisions to be made, and looking at reviews and everything around games, and yes, looking at active player counts and noting their decline and how quick that decline happens. This is all factored into the decisions that we're making on what games to play and what games to spend our time on. And
to jump in on that as he wraps up, though, is that I think essentially the one thing in terms of the model ends up being is that, does the game continue to try and invite people back in, right? So an initial decline, when it comes to MMOs, I look at Final Fantasy 14, like, does the game continue to invite people back in? And it does. And I think that's actually one of the real critical features of it, because then you end up having these mini hype cycles within these big hype cycles. Hey, here's the news, here's the patch, here's the content. Oh, here's the news, here's the patch, here's the content. And I think that essentially establishes that model where it's okay to take breaks, and then it's okay to return. And that in and of itself is a fine line. It's going to be something that's very challenging to kind of create and to cultivate. And I think Final Fantasy XIV specifically does that very well. And that's what I actually look at in terms of that in the current currency numbers. And I think essentially what we see is that content, communication, and consistency, especially, like I would say also, you kind of have to have a unique hook, because if you just had here's 14 and here's a version of 14 that's a clone, and it's like, it's not as good, well, why would you want to go put your time in there? So you do have to kind of have a unique hook that kind of like supplements that, like what is unique about your game and your experience so that when new content comes out, people are interested in checking it out. People are interested in returning. People are interested in searching it. People will click on a video or a link whenever that pops up. It might say like, I haven't looked at this game in a while. What's been going on with it? And so as long as those things kind of continue to cycle through, you'll end up seeing kind of that ebb and flow. But you do also, and that's why I look at it as a massive risk. Like you got to have the financial backing and the money and the commitment to it, right? If you're not committed to it, and if you just dip out, ultimately, I think that's where, when it comes down to gaming, that's where for me, like, you lose my trust. Like you got to work, like I'm going to go ahead and say like, all right, you say you're going to be here for 10 years. Let's give it a go. Let's see what happens, especially if I like your game. And then if you continue to deliver on it, you solidify it. But if you kind of say like, oh, then this is really hard, it's been a year, we're done. If Final Fantasy 14 1.0 said, well, we're sorry, we're just going to say oopsie and call it a day, like that would have forever impacted my relationship with future Square Enix games. But Square Enix, like, yeah, if they want to release another MMO, I'm there. I know that they'll work hard to make sure that it's right if it's not right at launch, you know. And that's just kind of feel we'll let Force follow it out, and we'll go from there.
There you go. That is going to do it for this video. This was fun, a little bit different than my usual fare, but nevertheless, I had a good time. I hope you enjoyed it. It's kind of fun diving into a topic like this. Thank you guys so much, as always, for watching. Hope you enjoy the content. I'll see you in the next one, all right? Take it easy.
All right, guys, that is the video. Hopefully you guys go check it out if you haven't seen it already in your feed. Thank you guys so much for sending it my way. Hopefully you enjoyed my thoughts, kind of cut up here for you in and of itself. And yeah, we're going to be having a lot of fun. Lots of stuff coming up this week. So if you're still here after this epic video, this Friday we're doing a St. Jude's charity stream over on Twitch, kicking it off in the evenings. Actually playing some New World, doing a fishing tournament itself. So hopefully you come hang out, and lots of cool stuff happening this week here on the channel. Lots of launches, lots of stuff to be excited about. And anyway, I'm just happy that you guys are here. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I'll see you in my next one. But until then, take care.
Yeah. It's time to chill out on the couch and read some comments. That's right. You know me when it comes to Destiny. I'm off with the clan, and I'm glad you're feeling better. Oh yeah.